first presenter for this afternoon. So over the last 3 decades, there have been thousands of estimates of the strength of natural selection in the wild. But if we were to take a typical estimate of selection and combine it with a typical heritability for a fitness-related trait, we would predict a rate of evolution that's an order of magnitude faster than what we usually observe. One explanation, or possible explanation for this, is that the natural selection that we're measuring in the wild is not sustained, but instead fluctuates either in space or time. Now, it's clear that in some systems, selection does fluctuate quite strongly, but the general evidence for the prevalence of fluctuating selection in nature is less clear. Most of this ambiguity comes from the fact that most of what we know about natural selection in the wild comes from studies that have no temporal or spatial replication at all, and those that do have replication often lack sufficient statistical power to be able to discriminate true fluctuating selection from sampling error. So for the past 27 years, we've been studying marked population of red squirrels in the Yukon Territory of Canada, where we can follow their reproduction and survival throughout their entire lives. Red squirrels are territorial and defend exclusive individual-based territories. Okay. We can access offspring soon after they're born by climbing up into the spruce trees and temporarily removing them from the nest, and can mark them prior to first emergence from the natal nest. The juveniles are then weaned at about 70 days of age, and at that point they need to find a territory of their own. If they don't find a territory at that stage, they don't survive. So this is an important component of lifetime fitness, this survival from birth to recruitment, and that's the period of time that I'm going to focus on for today. So over the past 27 years, we've followed the fate and phenotypes of over 4,500 juveniles. We measure lots of different aspects of them and their lives, but the thing I'm going to focus on today is their birth date and selection on birth date. So for any one particular year, then, we can measure a selection differential as the difference between the mean birth date for individuals that recruit into the population minus the mean birth date of all juveniles born in that particular year. So in 1994, and as an example, we had 182 juveniles born, only 14 of which recruited, and this resulted in strong directional selection favoring earlier born offspring with a selection differential of -11 days. But if we take this result from 1994 and extrapolate it across the time series, or at least calculate it separately for each year, you can see that selection is not at all consistent. Some years have significant selection for earlier born offspring, while other years have significant selection for later born offspring. Over this 27-year period, population density has fluctuated quite a great deal, and population density is negatively associated with selection on birth dates in red squirrels. So in years when population density is low, selection tends to favor later born offspring. In years when population density is high, earlier born offspring are favored, but you can see that this relationship is nonlinear. We've also been experimentally manipulating density through a food supplementation experiment. So for the past 12 years, we've been supplementing replicate populations of squirrels with food, which enhances their survival and has effectively doubled the population density in the experimental areas relative to the controls here shown in black. And as you might expect then, that selection on birth date in our food supplemented areas is more negative than it is in the control areas over this same 11-year period. Now, this is a less than perfect experiment because we've only manipulated density indirectly by manipulating food, but it seems to suggest then that population density is what's causing fluctuating selection on juvenile birth dates. So at this point, maybe we could stop, but I wanted to dig into this a little bit further because I wanted to think more carefully about the particular way in which density was affecting selection. And there's really two different ways that an agent of selection can alter selection. The first is that it can change the functional relationship between a trait and fitness. But alternatively, the population might instead be heterogeneous, made up of multiple underlying functional relationships, where in this case, some individuals within the population at one point in time might have higher fitness if they're born earlier, whereas other individuals in the same population might have higher fitness if they're born later. When we measure natural selection, what we're measuring is the averaging out or integration across these different underlying functional relationships. And so perhaps then what we might be seeing is the agent of selection not altering these underlying functional relationships, but just the relative prevalence of each of these different underlying tactics. Now, we're used to thinking about these sorts of things in terms of mating tactics, and potentially if you've got some sort of obvious color polymorphism in your population. But in this case, we have no obvious polymorphism, and essentially I'm trying to understand whether or not these alternative tactics exist in retrospect. So what I did was to go back and identify the way in which each of those juveniles recruited into the population. And there are basically four main categories. The first is that juveniles can compete for a vacant territory during the summer of their birth so that they're settled at the time that caching occurs. The second option is that when resources are plentiful, they can create a new territory of their own from scratch during the caching season. Finally, or sorry, not finally, but third, they can not compete for a vacant territory through the summer and simply settle after caching has completed. And I call this a floating strategy, although I don't know to what degree they're actually floating. And the last way in which a juvenile can acquire a territory is essentially by not leaving home at all, by remaining philopatric. In some cases, this occurs when the mother dies and the juvenile takes over their territory. But in most cases, this occurs through a bequeathal event where the mother actually gives up her territory to her offspring and moves somewhere else. Okay. So we can take our example from 1994 and simply reclassify these survivors based on the way in which they recruited and split these out to look at how the phenotypes of the juveniles differed among these different recruitment tactics. And in this particular case then, all we're doing is to replace our mean phenotype after selection by something a little bit more specific, which is just a weighted average of the mean phenotypes of each of these different ways in which juveniles recruit. And each of these is weighted by the proportion of surviving juveniles that use that particular tactic. Okay? So if we look across all of the data then, we see that the surviving juveniles in gray here are in fact a heterogeneous group. Okay? And it seems like juveniles that recruit in these different ways have different phenotypes, at least in terms of their birth date. So juveniles that compete for a territory and remain philopatric are born earlier than average, whereas those that create a new territory or float are born later than average. So this raises the question then of whether selection acting on birth date is being influenced through population density by a change in the difference between each of these tactics and the overall population, or whether density is having its effect on the relative proportion of juveniles that survive using each of these tactics. Okay, so we're essentially trying to determine then whether these gray bars are moving up and down, or whether it's simply the number of individuals in each of these categories that is causing selection to change from one period to the next. Okay? And what we find, first of all, is that there is evidence that density affects the prevalence of these different tactics. So as density increases, the proportion of juveniles that are recruiting into the population through floating declines, and the proportion of individuals that recruit through the philopatric tactic increases. And if you remember, floaters are born later than average, and philopatric individuals are born earlier than average. So this means that this increase in density could affect natural selection through a change in the relative proportion of these different recruitment tactics. But density also affects the functional relationship of one of the tactics, the floating tactic. There's no effect of density on any of the other tactics. But for floaters, this relationship between the mean phenotype of floaters and the mean phenotype prior to selection is influenced by density. At low density, we see that floaters are born later than average, but as density increases, okay, floaters are closer and closer to the population average prior to the selective event. Okay? So overall, what we see in this population is that natural selection fluctuates from one year to the next. These fluctuations seem to be caused by changes in population density, but the surviving juveniles are not a homogeneous population. Okay? The survivors are composed of juveniles that have recruited in several different ways, each of which seems to have its own underlying functional relationship. And that this effect of population density on natural selection seems to be occurring through an effect on both the prevalence of these alternative tactics as well as the underlying functional relationships between birth date and fitness within those tactics. And with that, I'll thank the funding sources and the many, many, many field assistants who helped collect data over the years. And I think I've got plenty of time for questions.
Can you treat the tactic or strategy as a trait and then look at maybe correlational selection?
Yeah, the problem is that we're not able to identify the tactic prior to selection. We can only sort of backcast and look in retrospect. Sorry?
You could, that would be fine, right? You could do it in retrospect.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
That might be, sort of shed some light on the analysis to try that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see any interesting patterns by adult survival?
The consequence of these juveniles, no. So I haven't followed these juveniles to see what the consequences are of the way in which they recruited for any other component of their fitness yet. But no, that's a good point. I haven't looked at that.
Whether there's any predators or anything that hurt them?
No, I mean the predators don't, as far as we can tell, don't seem to be an important selective agent in the system. Yeah, can't say for sure, but it doesn't seem to be.
Any idea what the mechanisms are that cause an individual to become a floater, or either they all compete and only some of them will make it, or?
No, well so I don't know, and that's my big concern, is whether these are in fact actual tactics, right? Or whether these are just different possible outcomes, and that the juveniles are all essentially doing the same thing, but they just have different possible outcomes. And so we're starting to collect some data on what the juveniles are doing to see if juveniles that are born earlier are doing things differently than juveniles that are born later, and does what they are doing during the summer influence how they end up recruiting. But it's a bit more challenging to do, and it's going to take some more work. Yeah.
Is there a difference in body condition in some role with point disease based on
No, so not body condition, but the growth rate of the juveniles, how quickly they grow while they're in the nest, also